1. East African Highlander Ancestry. Some people can sprint at altitudes where lowlanders can barely walk, and it's not training. It's blood chemistry written into the genome thousands of years ago. The Ethiopian highlands sit between 2,000 and 4,000 meters. Oxygen up there is thin enough to wreck most newcomers within a week. Populations that lived there for tens of thousands of years got selected generation after generation for whatever variants kept babies alive in low oxygen air. The result is a finely tuned cardiovascular adaptation that delivers more oxygen per breath without thickening the blood the way most altitude responses do. The biological advantage shows up as efficient hemoglobin saturation, better capillary density, and a metabolism that doesn't panic in thin air. Modern example, look at the marathon and 10K record books. Ethiopian and Kenyan highland runners dominate distance events at a rate that has nothing to do with coincidence. The hidden trade-off is subtle. The same adaptation that thrives at altitude can make sea-level living slightly less efficient for some individuals, and the populations carry a higher load of certain altitude-specific genetic variants that don't always travel well to other environments. 2. Arctic and Inuit Ancestry. You eat a stick of butter for breakfast, and your blood work looks better than someone eating salads. For some Inuit lineages, that's not a metaphor. The Arctic offers almost no plant food for half the year. Survival meant a diet that was 70 to 80% fat from marine mammals and fish, sustained for millennia. Populations evolved unique variants in fatty acid metabolism, particularly in the FADS genes, that let them process huge quantities of long-chain omega-3s and saturated fat without the metabolic damage that diet would cause in most populations. The biological advantage is a metabolism built for ketosis as a default state, not a fad. Cold tolerance is part of the package. Brown fat distribution and basal metabolic rate run higher in cold environments. The modern example is the long-running Inuit health paradox, where traditional diets correlated with low rates of cardiovascular disease despite extreme fat intake. The hidden trade-off is brutal and modern. The exact same genome handles processed carbs and refined sugar worse than almost any other population. The Western diet hit Arctic communities like a metabolic ambush. 3. Northern European Ancestry. Most adult mammals can't drink milk. Most adult humans, globally, also can't. Northern Europeans are the weird outliers. About 10,000 years ago, dairy farming spread through northern and central Europe. The mutation that keeps the lactase enzyme switched on into adulthood, called lactase persistence, gave its carriers a massive nutritional edge. They could drink milk year-round, especially in winters when other food was scarce. Selection pressure was enormous. The variants swept through the population in a few thousand years, which is fast in evolutionary terms. The biological advantage is the ability to digest lactose into adulthood, turning fresh dairy into a viable food source. Instead of a digestive crisis, the modern example is obvious. Walk into a Danish supermarket, the dairy aisle is a wall. That's not just culture. It's a population that genuinely tolerates dairy in volume. The hidden trade-off is mostly cultural confusion. Northern Europeans assume everyone can drink milk. Roughly 65% of the global adult population can't, and pushing dairy-heavy diets onto lactose-intolerant populations has caused a lot of unnecessary suffering. 4. Sub-Saharan African Ancestry, a genetic mutation that can kill you in one form protects you in another. It's one of the most studied trade-offs in human biology. Malaria has been a top killer in sub-Saharan Africa for thousands of years. In environments where malaria is endemic, evolution selected for variants in the hemoglobin gene that disrupted the parasite's ability to infect red blood cells. The most famous is the sickle cell variant. Carrying one copy gives strong protection against severe malaria. Carrying two copies causes sickle cell disease. The biological advantage applies to heterozygous carriers who get malaria resistance without the disease. The modern example is geographic. The frequency of the sickle cell trait maps almost perfectly onto historical malaria zones in Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of South Asia. Where malaria was deadly, the trait was protective enough to spread despite its catastrophic homozygous form. The hidden trade-off is the disease itself. Two copies means a lifetime of pain crises, organ damage, and reduced life expectancy. The math worked at the population level. It's harsh on the individuals it landed wrong. 5. Southeast Asian sea nomad ancestry. There are people in the Pacific who can dive 13 minutes on a single breath, and the reason isn't training. Their organs are different. The Bajau people of Southeast Asia have lived a sea-based lifestyle for over 1,000 years, freediving daily for fish, octopus, and shellfish. Researchers found that the Bajau have spleens roughly 50% larger than neighboring populations who don't dive. The spleen acts as an oxygenated blood reservoir during breath holds. A bigger spleen means a longer dive. The biological advantage is straightforward. More oxygen storage, longer dive times, deeper descents. Genetic studies pinpointed variants in the PDE10A gene linked to spleen size, with strong selection signals. The modern example is the Bajau divers themselves, routinely working at depths of 60 meters with minimal equipment, free of the decompression injuries that hit recreational divers. The hidden trade-off is that the trait is highly specialized. Outside of diving, the larger spleen offers little advantage and may carry minor risks during certain illnesses, particularly malaria-related splenic complications. 6. Pacific Islander and Polynesian ancestry. The same biology that helped your ancestors survive a 1,000-mile canoe voyage is the biology that makes modern processed food a metabolic disaster. Polynesians colonized the Pacific in voyages that took weeks across open ocean with no certainty of finding land. Survival selected for bodies that could store energy aggressively during abundance and ration it during scarcity. The thrifty genotype hypothesis fits Polynesian populations particularly well. Calorie-dense storage, robust muscle mass, efficient fat retention. The biological advantage was massive in a context of unpredictable food supply. Polynesians could survive long voyages, famines, and seasonal scarcity that would have killed less metabolically efficient people. The modern example is the dominance of Polynesian and Pacific Islander populations in sports requiring strength, mass, and explosive power. NFL rosters and rugby teams are statistical evidence of selection effects. The hidden trade-off arrived with Western food. The same energy storage biology, dropped into an environment of unlimited refined carbs and sugar, produces some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity in the world. The genome that built empires across the Pacific is now in a fight with a 7-Eleven. 7. Mediterranean ancestry. The blood disorder that kills you in adulthood once protected your ancestors from one of history's deadliest diseases. The Mediterranean basin was a malaria zone for thousands of years. Populations from Greece, Italy, Cyprus, Sardinia, and parts of the Middle East evolved high rates of thalassemia and G6PD deficiency variants. Like sickle cell, these alter red blood cell function in ways that disrupt malaria parasites. Carriers got partial protection. Selection pressure pushed the frequency to remarkable levels in some regions. The biological advantage is malaria resistance for heterozygous carriers. In Sardinia, where malaria was historically intense, thalassemia trait frequencies reached 10 to 20% in some villages. The modern example is the geography of the trait. Public health programs in Cyprus and Sardinia now screen routinely because the frequency is high enough that two carriers meeting and having children together is a real public health concern. The hidden trade-off is the homozygous form, which causes severe anemia and historically reduced life expectancy dramatically. The same evolutionary deal as sickle cell, played out in a different population. 8. East Asian ancestry. About 40% of East Asians get red, dizzy, and nauseous after one drink. It looks like a bug. It's actually a feature with deep evolutionary debate around it. A variant in the ALDH2 gene, common across Han Chinese, Japanese, and Korean populations, reduces the body's ability to break down acetaldehyde, a toxic byproduct of alcohol metabolism. Carriers experience the famous Asian flush response. The variant rose to high frequency in populations roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, which lines up suspiciously with the spread of rice agriculture and rice-based fermentation. The biological advantage is harder to pin down, but the leading theory is that the variant discourages heavy alcohol consumption and provides some protection against certain pathogens that thrived in fermenting grain environments. The modern example is straightforward. Populations carrying the ALDH2 variant have lower rates of alcohol abuse, but higher rates of esophageal cancer when carriers do drink heavily, because the unmetabolized acetaldehyde is itself a strong carcinogen. The hidden trade-off is the cancer risk. Cultural drinking pressure plus a genetic mismatch is a dangerous combination. 9. Middle Eastern and North African ancestry. The body that survives 50-degree desert heat has water management hardware most populations don't. Middle Eastern and North African populations evolved across some of the harshest arid environments on the planet. Selection pressures acted on heat dissipation, water retention, and metabolic efficiency in conditions of chronic dehydration and extreme thermal load. The biological advantage shows up as efficient sweat gland function, kidney concentration ability, and circulatory adjustments that maintain blood pressure under heat stress better than non-adapted populations. There's also a higher prevalence of certain protective variants for arid zone parasites and pathogens. The modern example is endurance work in heat. Populations from arid origins generally tolerate sustained high-temperature conditions better than populations from cool, wet climates. The performance gap shows up in military, agricultural, and athletic contexts in hot environments. The hidden trade-off is sun and arid climate biology in cold, dark environments. Migration to Northern Europe or Canada often produces vitamin D deficiency, seasonal affective patterns, and a general mismatch between an arid-tuned body and a wet climate life. 10. Central Asian ancestry. A genome built for the steppe is one of the most environmentally flexible in the species. Central Asian populations evolved across an extreme range. Mountain plateaus, dry steppe, deserts, harsh winters, brutal summers. Mobility was the survival strategy for thousands of years. The selection pressures didn't optimize for one extreme. They optimized for adaptability across many. The biological advantage is mixed environment resilience. Reasonable cold tolerance, decent heat tolerance, moderate altitude tolerance, robust musculoskeletal frame for sustained physical work, and a metabolism that handles wide swings in food availability. None of these traits are best in class. The combination is unusually balanced. The modern example is the historical pattern of Central Asian populations expanding into wildly different environments and thriving in most of them. The same biology that worked on the Mongolian steppe also worked when those populations moved into temperate cities. The hidden trade-off is that generalist adaptation tends to lose to specialists in any single extreme environment. Central Asian populations don't dominate altitude sport, cold weather endurance, or heat tolerance work. They're solid everywhere, exceptional almost nowhere. 11. Indigenous American ancestry. The same metabolism that helped your ancestors survive an Andean winter at 4,000 meters now has to deal with grocery stores that didn't exist 100 years ago. Indigenous American populations evolved across an enormous range of environments, with localized adaptations to high altitude in the Andes, cold in the Arctic regions, and tropical conditions in the Amazon. The Andean adaptation in particular involves different mechanisms than the East African one. More red blood cells and increased oxygen carrying capacity, rather than altered hemoglobin saturation. The biological advantage in the Andean case is altitude tolerance with a different metabolic strategy. In other regions, it's resistance to specific local pathogens, parasites, and dietary patterns shaped by traditional foods like maize, cassava, and bison. The modern example shows up clearly in altitude. Quechua and Aymara populations in the Andes function at 4,000 meters in ways most lowland populations can't. The hidden trade-off is the post-contact metabolic disaster. Many indigenous American populations carry strong selection for traditional pre-colonial diets, and the introduction of refined sugar, alcohol, and processed grains has produced some of the highest diabetes and metabolic disease rates in the world. The genome was tuned for one food system and dropped into another. 12. South Asian ancestry. A body optimized for low-calorie agricultural life under blistering sun has biology that quietly punishes modern abundance. South Asia is one of the longest-running agricultural civilizations on the planet, with populations selected for thousands of years on rice and grain-based diets in hot, humid, high UV conditions. Selection acted on heat tolerance, UV protection through skin pigmentation, and metabolic efficiency on relatively low-calorie staple grain diets. The biological advantage is excellent UV protection through high melanin content, heat tolerance through efficient sweat function, and a metabolism that extracted maximum nutrition from limited calorie intake. The modern example is the global success of South Asian populations in agricultural and tropical contexts, plus the relatively low rates of UV-related skin cancer in populations that retain their original geography. The hidden trade-off is one of the cruelest mismatches in modern medicine. South Asian populations carry one of the highest global rates of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome, often at lower body weights than other populations. The body was tuned for scarcity and physical labor. Office work plus modern food is a metabolic ambush. 13. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. A small founding population from 1,000 years ago shaped a genome that now drives some of the most important medical research in the world. Ashkenazi Jewish populations descend from a relatively small founding group in medieval Europe, around 350 to 500 individuals, roughly 600 to 800 years ago, followed by long periods of community endogamy. This created a classic founder effect. Certain rare genetic variants became unusually concentrated in the population, while overall genetic diversity within the group remained narrower than in larger source populations. The biological situation is genetic concentration of specific variants, including some associated with disease risk like BRCA1, BRCA2, Tay-Sachs, Gaucher disease, and factor XLN deficiency, as well as protective and neutral variants whose frequencies are also unusually high. The modern example is medical genetics itself. Because the founder effect concentrated specific variants, Ashkenazi populations have been disproportionately important in identifying disease genes. The original BRCA mutations, the Tay-Sachs gene, and several Gaucher and Parkinson's-related variants were mapped largely through Ashkenazi family studies, which has benefited every population that came after. The hidden trade-off is the disease load itself. The same bottleneck that made the genetic mapping possible also concentrates real risk for the descendant population, which is why genetic screening for several conditions is now a standard part of family planning in many Ashkenazi communities. 14. Slavic Ancestry. A genome shaped by some of Europe's coldest, longest winters carries cold tolerance biology that quietly outperforms most populations in harsh seasonal environments. Slavic populations evolved across the cold continental interior of Eastern Europe and Russia, with brutal winters, short growing seasons, and large temperature swings between summer and winter. Selection pressure acted on cold tolerance fat distribution for insulation, robust musculoskeletal frame for sustained physical labor in harsh conditions, and metabolic efficiency on grain and meat-heavy diets that vary dramatically by season. The biological advantage is cold environment durability, higher tolerance for prolonged cold exposure, robust thermoregulation, and physical resilience under sustained physical demand in harsh climates. The modern example is the historical and continuing dominance of Slavic populations in cold weather sports, heavy athletics, and physically demanding work in cold environments. The same physical traits also show up in military endurance metrics in cold weather conditions. The biology that thrives in cold continental climates can struggle in tropical or extremely hot environments, and the traditional Slavic diet, when transplanted to modern sedentary life, produces high rates of cardiovascular disease and alcohol-related illness. 15. Celtic Ancestry. The lightest skin in the human species evolved for one specific reason, and it's still working as designed. Celtic and Northern Atlantic populations evolved in some of the lowest UV environments humans have ever lived in. Ireland, Scotland, and Atlantic coastal Europe get cloud cover for most of the year, with weak sun even in summer. Selection pressure pushed skin pigmentation lighter and lighter because every bit of UV needed to be captured for vitamin D synthesis. The variance behind Celtic red hair, fair skin, and freckling cluster around vitamin D efficiency in low UV conditions. The biological advantage is exceptional vitamin D synthesis under minimal sun exposure. A Celtic ancestry person can generate vitamin D from sun exposure that wouldn't register on a darker-skinned individual at all. The modern example is the geographic distribution of red hair and freckling, which maps tightly onto the cloudiest, lowest UV regions of Europe. The hidden trade-off is sun. Drop a Celtic ancestry person into Australia, the American Southwest, or any high UV environment, and the same biology that thrived in Ireland becomes a melanoma risk factor. Skin cancer rates among Celtic descent populations in sunny countries are among the highest in the world. The genome was optimized for gray skies. It struggles in bright ones.